Alrighty. Okay, what we're going to try to do is get caught up a little bit. If we don't make it all the way, that'd be fine. We'll pick it up somewhere along the line. Of course, what we want to be doing is, I didn't mention this, but reading the text. Certainly want to be reading the text. Being familiar with what's going on in the life of Job. When we finished last time, we had gotten through chapter 1. Chapter 1. And let me get where left off. Of course, chapter 1 ended with Job losing all of his property and losing his children. And the last we hear about Job in chapter 1 is, in all of this, Job did not sin. And so what happened was Satan failed in his attack, and I guess he just gave up and decided to go home and let it go. That's not what Satan does, is it? Satan does not give up. That brings us to chapter 2. Satan's attack, verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2, is really what we have in this is kind of a replay of chapter 1. The second meeting of the sons of God presenting themselves before God. And again, we have God praising Job, speaking about how upstanding Job is. There's none like him. And what does Satan do? He begins to accuse Job. Satan is the great accuser. And so what we want to notice is when Satan begins his attack, he was attacking Job, not just physically or materially. He began his attack by accusation. Well, Job is serving you, but he's not serving you out of a pure heart. What did he say the reason for Job's obedience was? He put a hedge around him, and for what purpose? So what was Job gaining? Protection. He was getting all these material blessings, right? So he said, Job's not serving you for nothing. He's gaining something. After all, when we look at Job's description, how is Job described? Greatest man of the East. Richest man of his generation. And so he's gaining something. In essence, what he's really saying, and this is something we need to keep in mind, this is central to the theme of Job. It's not really an attack on Job. Satan is attacking God. God, you are not worthy of worship. The only way you can get someone to worship you, to obey you, to honor you, and to love you is if you buy them. That's the only way you can do it. If you do what, then he'll curse you to your face. Take it away. Now, he took his material blessings away from him. He took the things most precious in his life away from him. What'd Job do? Remain faithful. So this time Satan claimed Job would give up all he had for what? He wouldn't give it up for his material blessings. For his life. If you take his life or you touch his life. So in effect, here's what he was saying about Job. Job, You didn't love your children like you ought to have. That's what he was saying about Job. You didn't care for your children because I took them away. Obviously, you didn't care. Isn't that a terrible thing to say about someone? See, we don't really think about that sometimes when we study the book of Job. So if God will allow him to take away his health, he'll curse him to his face. He uses this phrase, skin for skin. Now that phrase, skin for skin, is an ancient proverb. The skin is figurative for any outward good. Okay? Nothing outward is so dear that a man will not exchange it for some other outward good. Okay? So you'll make an exchange for it. So what's happening here is Satan is amused at man's egotism, saying Job was willing to part with property and his children because they are outward exchangeable goods. But he'll give up everything, including his religion, if you make him feel bad physically. You take his health away, you touch his skin, you touch his bones, you touch his flesh. In other words, a man is willing to give up another's skin for his own skin. Okay? Give up his children for his own skin. That's a terrible thing. So now let's notice 7 through 10. Job kept his integrity. When Satan left the presence of God, what was the first thing he did? Oh boy, have you ever had a boil? Oh, I've had one in my life. One. Now think about this. Job had boils from the top of his head to the sole of his foot, covering his entire body. Nothing, to my knowledge, is more sore than a boil. Now, it has been suggested that the affliction Job had has been everything from leprosy to elephantitis, and likely it was just simply what it says it was, a boil. I can't think of anything worse than that. In fact, it was so bad, boil is a skin infection. It is a swelling where you get it. It was so bad it disfigured the man. Of course, it was all over his face. It was all over every place on his body. He couldn't find any position to get in where he could be easy. I mean, you lay down, the part touching where you're laying down is having pressure on it. You've heard of people laying in the bed so long that were sick, they got bed sores. Have you ever seen a bed sore? I've seen them. Bed sores are terrible. They can be huge and deep. My wife is a occupational therapist, and she started out in physical therapy. And at one time, physical therapists did wound care. And she would pack wounds. And I had a wound on my leg one time, several years ago. I had a spider bite. And I went to the hospital, and I went to the emergency room probably, I don't know, this has probably been 15 years ago. I was in Memphis. They lanced where the spider bite was, and they gave me a staph infection at the emergency room. Well, it almost killed me. So I had to go back, and I had to go into surgery. And they had to cut out where the infection was, and it had to heal from the inside out. So they had to pack it. It was huge. You would think that a place on your leg where it's that far to the bone couldn't hold much packing. Why? They put 2 or 3 bed sheets inside that thing, And so imagine Job is so sore and so infected that he's disfigured, and his friends couldn't even tell who he was. That's what kind of shape he was in. He couldn't eat. Well, imagine, he's trying to chew and he can't even move his jaws and close and bite and chew. He's hurting so bad. His sores were infested with worms. If you have an open sore, what happens if you can't treat that sore, or you hurt so bad you can't even wrap it? The flies will get on it. They lay their eggs. So now it's infested with worms. Loss of weight, pain, darkening of the skin, fever. And this didn't just last a couple of days. According to chapter 7, verse 3, this lasted for months. He was in pain. Then what did his wife suggest to him? Just go ahead and curse God and die. How should we feel about that? Well, perhaps she thought it was better that he died, that he didn't suffer. But to curse God meant to be guilty. To be guilty meant to die lost. Many well-meaning folks have uttered the words, "He's now at rest," over the body of a sinner who has passed on. No lost person is at rest. And so, why was it that Satan did not take the life of Job's wife? How discouraging is it when your spouse is not encouraging to you? I don't know that it gets much worse than that. Job didn't listen to his wife, and he reminded her, and this is a good lesson to all of us, we have to be willing to accept the good along with the bad when it comes to this life and the blessings that God offers us. Any comments? Well, let's notice in verses 11 and 13, 3 people show up. 3 friends. I guess we'll call them friends. The purpose of their visit was to mourn with Job, to be sad with him, to sit with him. We're to mourn with those who mourn. We're to be happy with those who are happy. And they were there to mourn over his affliction, to mourn over his loss. They were there to offer comfort. It seems that these 3 men were maybe his oldest and closest, most intimate friends. It appears maybe 2 months had passed since his home, since this latest affliction, chapter 7, verse 3, and at their arrival. So Job was probably sitting on the outside of his home as his friends approached. As they neared him, they saw someone, but they didn't recognize him because of his disfigurement. And when they realized it was him, they raised up their voice. They began to weep with lamentation. They tore their mantles, their outside robes. They cast dust up in the air to land on their heads, indicating their deepest mourning. That was a common practice and custom throughout the Old Testament. And they sat for 7 days and nights without a word. That was common for the period of mourning to last 7 days. We see that in Genesis 50, verse 10, 1 Samuel 31:13, and Ezekiel 3:15. Now, are we to assume that they sat there without moving for 7 days? No, I don't think so. I think they would have moved around for normal body functions. They would have partaken in normal eating exercises. They would have slept on their bedrolls next to Job. They probably would have spoken to each other. They would have spoken to the attendants, the people that were there, the servants. They simply would not have spoken to Job. They would not have tried to have engaged him in conversation. They would have respected what was going on with him. And, that was the custom for the person who was in deep mourning. But those men were shaken in their confidence in Job's goodness. And I think Job's confidence obviously was shaken. Any comments? All right, let's move into chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins with the first 10 verses of Job's lament. He has a lamentation. And it begins with Job opening his mouth. Now, what does it mean when we read that in the Bible? To open one's mouth. It just means he began to speak, right? That was a common idiom. Breaking the 7-day silence. Job began to speak. Now, his speech is described as a curse. Now, Job didn't curse God, as Satan had predicted, but he did set forth before his friends a lament regarding the day of his birth. Now, what did he say regarding the day of his birth? He deplored the day he was born. He wished he had never been born. We might even say in verses 4 through 10, he kind of doubled down on it. He said, let that day be darkness. We might say, let it be blotted out of the calendar. As if it never happened, right? He thought that it would have been better not to have been born at all. And then, Job brings up some very searching questions. Verses 11 through 26. Now, no doubt, Job understood this. His idea is this. He said, there's no changing history, right? We can't change where we are up to this point. As we look in chapter 3. He says, I've been conceived. But why didn't I die before birth? Right? Why didn't I just go ahead and die before my mother gave birth? Or during the birthing process? Why did he live? And why was I received with joy by my parents? Now, his idea is this. Why did all of that happen if all of these terrible things were going to happen to me? Why didn't I either die at conception, die during the process of my being formed, die during the birth process, or right after I was born? Why was I received with joy if the only thing that was going to happen to me, if my ultimate end is this? Why did the knees prevent me? Now, this word prevent is not to be understood like we know that word prevent. Prevent means to go before. Pre means before. Prevent. The idea is if he had not been handled delicately by the nurse, by his mother, he would have perished. Okay, laid on the knees of his mother after having been born, and if that had happened, he could have avoided all these troubles. If he had just simply had allowed the course of nature, if the elements had been allowed to have just taken him, instead of him being taken care of. He says, lying still and being quiet. See, that's a reference to sleeping the sleep of death, verses 13 through 16. You see, he could have avoided the trouble with that as well. Because there, the wicked cease from troubling. 17 through 19, in death, who can cause you a problem? There's no problems in death, right? When we look at the account of the rich man and Lazarus, we see Lazarus having all these problems in life. We see the rich man having no problems in life. And then at death, we see them crossing into the Hadean realm. And where's Lazarus? He's in the bosom of Abraham, isn't he? Has no problems at all. He's happy. See, that's the thing about a person who is a child of God. Whether he's living in the patriarchal time like Job, whether he lived under the law of Moses, or whether he's a Christian. See, the thing about dying as a child of God, that process does not have to be a worrisome process. And that's exactly what Paul talked about, 1 Corinthians 15, right? Where is thy sting, O death, where's thy victory? Well, see, death doesn't have a victory for the child of God. Because once the child of God passes from this life to the next, how does that child of God traverse from this life to the next? Does he go alone? He's carried by the hands of angels. He does not make that trip by him or herself. Isn't that wonderful to consider that? That is wonderful. And so you don't have trouble and misery. The wicked cease from troubling you in death, if you're a child of God. And see, Job understood that. This word light, he says, wherefore, 20 through 23, wherefore is light given to him that is in misery? Why is light given to one who is living in misery and bitterness of soul? The word light here is used in parallel to the word life. His desire for death is greater than the treasure seeker's desire for treasure. So he wants to die. He wants to go on. He is ready to leave this misery. And we see in 24 through 26, his worst fears are realized. Literally, he says, for I fear a fear. As the worst fears imaginable assaulted Job, he was afraid worse was even going to come. And he was right. Worse was coming. But listen, he just started. He's got a long way to go. And it wasn't going to get better. It was going to get worse. Any comments? Questions? All right, let's notice verse 4. Now Job is going to begin to be assaulted verbally by his so-called friends. So Job, he comes out of his 7-day silence. He makes his lamentation. And now Eliphaz makes the first charge against Job. Job, you are a rank sinner. If you weren't, this wouldn't be happening to you. Verses 1 through 11. Now notice how Eliphaz begins. He begins his speech with soft words. He's kind of buttering him up just a little bit. He doesn't charge at him full force to begin with. He's kind of massaging him a little bit, right? But he suggests to Job that I can't hold back. Job, I can't hold back because I believe you have offended God. And they're cloaking what they're doing in their being righteous. Job, I have to tell you this because you have offended God and I'm going to stand up for God. So I've got to tell you this because I want you to do better. And he wants to know, Job, would you be offended if I made some observations which might implicate you in some sin? That's a red flag, isn't it? That ought to be a red flag. So what he's doing is he's kind of apologizing beforehand based on all the things that Job had done for other people in similar situations. Job, you've done this, this, and this for people. Now, based on all the things you've done for others, I'm going to do that for you. So don't get upset when I pull the rug out from under your feet. So what he does, he begins to claim that Job is accusing God of being unjust as he cursed the day of his birth. And so what Eliphaz does is he points out the old principle of one reaps what he sows. And it must be applicable in this present situation, verses 7 through 8. And his position is God never punished the innocent. So you must be guilty of something. God has never punished the innocent. So is Eliphaz's statement true? God never punishes the innocent? Well, sure it's true. Eliphaz makes a true statement, but his application of the principle to Job is in error. He has made a mistake in applying that to Job. God does not punish the innocent, but there are cases in this life where the innocent suffer. And Eliphaz is not understanding that. He's completely out of his realm when it comes to understanding how the innocent suffer. So Eliphaz points to another biblical truth, verses 9 through 11. The wicked will be blasted by the power of God. Well, what's that mean? They will inevitably perish. And it doesn't matter how strong they may be in the world's might, their power will ultimately be broken. Well, again, he spoke the truth, but just like before, he misapplied the principles when he applied them to Job. So their being wrong in the presumption is seen in the statement Job makes in chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. Let's notice that, Job 13, 1 through 5. Job makes a powerful statement over in that verse, or that passage. Job 13, beginning with verse 1. He says, Lo, mine eye hath seen all. This mine ear hath heard and understood it. What ye know, the same do I know also. He says, I'm not inferior unto you. Surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. Now this is where he calls them on the carpet, so to speak. But you are forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. In other words, if you fellows were smart, you'd shut your mouth. That would show your wisdom. But you're not. So you'll keep talking. And so that brings us to this part really has always bothered me. Verses 12 through 21. Eliphaz's alleged vision. So he says he gets some information straight from God. He tries to base his allegations against Job by appealing to this alleged vision that he received. Particularly verses 12 through 16. Now this vision happened on a different occasion, but it was about this very point under consideration. And the point was to demonstrate that people, mortal man, could not be more just than God. And he described this very curious situation where he had this vision, and it was the classic faint whisper in the night. He received this faint whisper in the night. Well, nobody believes that. Now, just like these other statements that Eliphaz made, now he's correct concerning this fake vision. I believe it's a fake vision. God cannot place His trust in any created being in the sense that they are as just as He is. Humans, His creation, is not as just as God is. It's just not possible. Okay? Now, He's correct in that, but again, the application is in the wrong place. He has misapplied that when he is pushing that on Job. And on top of that, I believe that Eliphaz has lied. I don't think he had a vision. I don't think God spoke to him by a faint whisper in the night and gave him this information. That's common knowledge, isn't it? That's like I used to work with a fellow years ago, nearly 20 years ago, and he said, you know, the Holy Spirit spoke to me and told me to stop lying. I said, you're lying right now. So it didn't work. I said, come on, man. You know, you got to come up. I said, don't insult my intelligence. You got to come up with something better than that. And so Eliphaz continues his speech into chapter 5. Any comments, questions? So Eliphaz makes some pretty rough statements here to Job, verses 1 through 16. And this says a lot about Job's character here, that in the end he still offers sacrifice for Eliphaz. He tells Job to call out. Go ahead, call out, Job. No one's going to hear you. He told him that the foolish take root, meaning, Job, you're a fool. And you were blessed for a while. Now you're paying the price. Then he says this, Job, your children are far from safety. Yep. They were murdered. Now that's a low blow. That's a low blow that he gives to Job. And then he makes this statement. He says they were crushed in the gate. Now, what was the gate? Now, remember, we're in the patriarchal age. The judicial decisions were made in the gate. Okay? The judgment. That was the judgment seat, right? So if his children were crushed in the gate, what he's saying is, Job, your children got what they deserved. So they died lost. Now, telling that to a man of God, a faithful child of God, how would that affect someone? That's the worst thing you could tell a parent, isn't it? Who's a faithful child of God. So, these are some terrible things. Then he says this, he says, affliction doesn't come forth from the dust. Meaning, it isn't from natural causes, Job. God is punishing you. This isn't just happening. And then because he's such a good friend to Job, verses 8 through 11, he gives him some advice. He says, Job, you brought all this upon yourself by your sinful conduct. Now it's time to commit yourself to God. Now, Eliphaz made an excellent point, but again, his judgment is wrong in applying it to Job. And by believing Job's condition was caused by personal sin. Any comments? Now, he goes on to say in verses 17 through 27, the gist of this section is that God's correction should be desired. So again, he makes a wonderful point. God loves his children and he chastises those for whom he cares. Now we read that in the New Testament, don't we? The writer of Hebrews talks about that. Any good parent will chastise his or her children. Why do we do that? We don't want them to grow up and go to the pen, right? I read this story. I don't remember where I read it, or someone told me. I don't remember. This mother was spanking her child in public somewhere. This police officer came and got onto her. And she turned to the police officer and said, "Look, I'm taking care of him now, so you don't have to take care of him later." And I thought, boy, what a wonderful point. So a parent chastises the child to produce good Christians and good citizens, right? Did any of you see in the news, and I was talking to Peter on the way over here, the girl over in Antioch, Tennessee, who pepper sprayed the teacher because he took the phone away from her out of class? Man, that's why I'm not a teacher in a public school setting. I'd be in jail. Wouldn't have to worry about what they're going to do to her. They'd be trying to figure out what to do with me. The issue lying behind these statements is Eliphaz's belief Job is being punished for sin. Okay? And his point was Job will receive blessings and protections that the Lord can provide if he will repent. Well, his points again are excellent and appropriate if one is guilty of sin. Job does not fit that category. He is being wrongly accused, and Eliphaz does not know about which he is speaking. Any comments, questions? All right, that finishes up chapter 5. Let's move into chapter 6, see how far we get. All right, Job speaks again, chapter 6. I apologize for not putting holes in your notes, but I got tied up in a terrible crash on the way to the office, and I barely had time to print off the notes. But anyway, Job's grief and loss of hope, chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Now, in his answer, Job begins to describe his anguish and his grief. Now, what we're going to learn is Job is very descriptive in what's going on in his life. And if any of you have ever been to a point in your life where you feel like you can't get any lower, you can come up with some pretty good descriptive terms. If you've ever had some kind of a loss. Now, at this point in my life, the worst thing that has ever happened to me is the loss of my father. Never lost a wife or a child or anything like that. And while that process was going on in my life, I could come up with some pretty good descriptive terms of how I felt. I'd never felt that way before. And we read how Job is describing his anguish and his grief. And in his answer here to what Eliphaz had to say, he begins to describe that. And he asked for his friends to accurately assess his condition. And I think that's an honest statement. And he says, if you did that, you could come away understanding that my complaints are justified. He supposed that they had not understood or correctly appreciated his suffering. Now remember, these are the same men as they were walking up to him. They saw someone, but they did not recognize this person as Job. But automatically they are now assuming that Job has done something wrong. And so they're predisposed to blame him without understanding the extent of his sorrow. They need to understand his sorrow, and he wanted them to properly understand all of his suffering before they condemned him. So he wants to explain it to them to the best possible extent that he is able. So he maintained his lamentations. And he doesn't feel that it was unjustified or unreasonable. And he feels like that if they were to be measured in a balance against his complaints, that they would be found to be equal. And so in our sentiment, Job described his words as having been too great to be expressed in words. And so I believe there are times when grief is so great that we can't properly express that, even in prayer. And I think we read that in Psalm 77:4, and I think that's when the Holy Spirit has a role in helping us in our prayer as not the mediator, as what's the word I'm looking for? Romans 8:26, when the intercessor, as the Holy Spirit intercesses for us to God when we don't really know what we want to say. We know we've got a problem and we can't express it in exactly the way we want to express it. And the Holy Spirit will intercess for us, because who knows the hearts of all men? God does. And have you ever wanted to express something to God and you didn't know the exact way to put it? Well, God understands. And so I think that's the sentiment that Job is trying to get across. And he speaks of his loss of hope in verses 5 through 13. And what he does, he states is that his complaints are natural. And he uses the illustration of the donkey who only complains when there's no food. The donkey doesn't complain when there's plenty of food. The ox doesn't complain when there's plenty of food. And he talks about unseasoned food. The egg white that has no salt. Now, I love eggs, but I want salt on them. You know, I remember Brother Cates, he taught this class when I took it. I was so fortunate. And he said, I don't want to eat any egg at all, but if I was going to eat an egg, I'd want salt on it. And I thought, Brother Cates, as brilliant and genius as you are, you won't eat a good egg. But anyway, you know, when sorrow becomes so accumulated, it's common for a person to have those feelings, right? And so we become overwhelmed with pain, but that is not evidence that a person is prepared for death. And Job is wanting death. He's overcome with pain. He's overcome with these feelings. But that doesn't mean that just because you're overcome with these feelings that you are prepared for death. Was Job prepared for death if death came? Well, sure he was. Job was. But just because a person is overcome and with feelings like this doesn't mean someone is prepared for death. It seems to me that probably the ungodly find themselves in situations like this more so than the godly do, where they're overcome with these feelings of hopelessness. That doesn't mean they're prepared for death. They may think they want death. They don't when it comes down to it. So Job is seeing God here as the force behind his suffering, and he asks God to go ahead and loosen your restraint and just take my life. He's seeing God as someone who's making him suffer, but he's holding him back, and he says, just go ahead and loosen the restraint and just take my life. And then we see 14 through 31, Job's assessment of his friends. And he rebukes his friends. Why does he rebuke them? Well, they hadn't shown him the proper kindness, especially at a time when his faith had been sorely tested. They'd been like, he describes them as a winter brook. You see a winter brook and it promises a clean, cool drink of water, and you get there and the stream is dry. And he pointed out that, he says, I hadn't asked you for financial help. You came here, I hadn't asked you for any financial help, but surely he could have received some spiritual help, some emotional help, but they offered no real help. They only tried to really disparage his name and undermine his confidence. And they dealt with him deceitfully. And he continued this illustration of a winter stream, and it appeared to give promise of needed water for the summer, but in hot weather it just evaporated. And he used this illustration of the caravans from Tema. The route of the caravans of Tema came from the North Arabia, and it connected the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Aqaba. And that area was well known for these streams descending from the mountains. And these caravans fully expected to be able to come through to this area and be able to get a drink, be able to fill their water skins. But often they would come through here, and guess what would happen to that winter stream? Be gone, be dried up. This is exactly what these friends were like. They were empty of anything encouraging. And they saw his great losses, both materially, both physically, but he didn't expect them to provide anything physically for him. And in fact, did we read about where Job would send a messenger out and ask them to come sit with him? We don't read about that, do we? Job didn't send for these guys to come and pester and bother him. He didn't even send a message for them to come sit and encourage him. And then he's told them, he said, he accused them of making desperate speeches, reproving him, but with no substance. In essence, they were all talk and no meat. And their attacks focused on his complaining, not on any wrongdoing. So you have someone who lost it all. And all they could muster was, Job, all you're doing is complaining. Well, I mean, he was in constant pain. He lost his children. He lost all his finances. He had nothing. And the best they could muster was, Job, you sure are complaining. He says, examine me. Even in examination of his countenance, they should have seen that he was sincere, that he wasn't lying. And so he asked them to carefully consider his situation and to see how, even during a time without written revelation, they should have been able to discern properly that prosperity does not prove acceptability from God, and that abject suffering, such as Job was experiencing, does not prove God is against the one suffering. And so he asked them to review their conclusions. Maybe we can say this, I don't know. At least they did stay with him and listen to what he had to say. I guess we could give them that much. Any comments, questions? No, he never did admit that he'd done wrong. In fact, he was rebuking them in chapter 6. And that's what he said. He said, your speeches are just full of hot air, in essence what he said. He said, you're just complaining because I'm complaining. You don't have any facts that I've done anything. You're just upset because I'm complaining about my health and my children were killed and, things of that nature. You're just here rubbing salt in my wounds. And so he's adamant that, and that's why he says in 28 through 31 of chapter 6 here, take a good look at me. Yes. Huh? Oh, did I say? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. I made a typo. Thank you for that. Anything else?
Children of Israel, when they would complain in the wilderness, a lot of times they accused God, like, Moses, why did you bring us here? Because my God bring us. Job's more of, I have no idea what's going on. Why has this happened?
Yeah,
he's remorseful as to what happened, not remorsing over him sinning.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. We're talking about the difference between Job complaining and making a lamentation over the children of Israel complaining during the wilderness wanderings, and really there's a difference. Job is actually making a lamentation, and the children of Israel were just complaining, right? They didn't have anything to complain about. Okay, nothing was really happening to them. Of course we know that they were rescued, right? They were rescued. They were given. They didn't have to work for anything. God gave them their food. Their clothes didn't wear out. He protected them. All that. Job was in actual distress. His health was shot. Satan did, and we're going to notice in the next couple of chapters that Satan, this wasn't a one-time deal on Job. This suffering physically increased. It increased. Okay? The physical body will heal. Not if Satan is around keeping an eye on it. Anything that might heal on Job, Satan was there to knock him down physically. It was increasing. Okay, so his health was shot. He was right at with all my heart, he was on the cusp of dying. Satan did everything he could without killing Job. He lost all of his finances because all of your wealth was measured in animals, livestock. Okay, all that was gone. His children were gone. He was destitute. So he was legitimate. So really what he was doing, we say complaining, he was making a lamentation over what had happened to him. Okay? So there's nothing wrong with that. Because, in all of this, what Job do? Did not sin. Now, we're going to notice that Job is a little rash in some things that he says moving forward. He could have probably stated some things a little differently. He's wrong in his assessment of the situation. But Job doesn't sin. And it's okay to make a lamentation over your situation. You lose someone you love. The stock market crashes and you lose all your retirement and they come take your house. And, is it okay to feel bad about that? Well, 100%. It's okay. Your best friend loses his or her mind and they begin to behave in a way that they shouldn't behave, and now they're no longer your best friend. That's very hurtful. Okay, is it okay to feel bad about that? 100%. And so, yeah, there's a huge difference there, and it's okay to make a lamentation. What's not okay is to be that person who is never happy, who is always complaining about something. Have you ever known someone every time you see them, it's just something's wrong? Nobody wants to be around that person. Okay? They may legitimately have something wrong from time to time, but are you going to tell me that every day you see them is always a bad day? Come on. You know, and even if it is something wrong every day, be a Christian. You know, if things are that bad, we need to read about Paul and understand what it's really like to have a bad day and a bad life. And then let's go back and read some more about Job. You know, but it's okay to have a lamentation and to lament bad things. And it's okay to talk with each other about that, right? We need to be able to talk to our brethren. How else are we going to weep with those who weep unless we know about it, right? We need to be able to do that. We need to be able to lean upon each other during our sad times, you know, and let's rejoice when it's time to rejoice. But it's okay to lament when it's time to be sad and to, you know, that's fine. We just can't be like Israel and just, you know, it's always the glass is empty. You know, it's not that it's half full, it's just empty. I'm sick of this light bread, you know, blah, 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 blah. You know, take me back to slavery. Really? What's wrong with you? You know, I remember we when the girls were growing up, we always read through the Bible every night. And it never failed. We'd go through Numbers. Every time we'd make our way back through Numbers, we'd be reading about that, and one of them would say, "Are they stupid?" You know, and that's how you feel, isn't it? You know, I'd have a 5-year-old hearing that about the 10th complaining, and they'd say, "Hey, are they stupid?" Because something bad would happen to them, and I said, "Well, I mean, what are you going to say to that?" Maybe, you know, something's wrong with them, right? And so we don't want to be that person. But that's good comment. Anything else? All right, well, we'll pick up here on chapter 7 next time. Go ahead and read and catch up through our next, where we're supposed to be, and maybe we'll get caught up here for long. Thank you so much.